joint I'm going to show you now is a corner halving joint. Halving joints are sometimes called half-lap joints, so this would be a corner half-lap joint. It's a very useful and simple joint, often used in frames or similar constructions. Its main advantage is that it leaves the surface of the frame flat, but has both pieces overlapping for their full width. It can also be used in the middle of a length of wood. It would then be called a T-halving or T-half-lap joint, and sometimes in the centre of two pieces of wood when it is called a cross-halving or cross-half-lap. The construction is very simple. It's a lap or rebate sawn halfway through the timber on both pieces, which then slot together to form the joint. Depending on the type of job, it can be secured by glue or nailed or screwed. Sometimes it is doweled and glued. The tools that we will need are the following: an HB pencil with a sharp point, a ruler, a tri-square, a marking gauge, a marking knife, saw, bench hook. The first task is to measure the width of the wood in order to mark out the rebate. My wood is exactly 45 wide. It's a good idea to leave a millimetre extra in the width in order to trim off when the joint is completed. So I'm measuring 46 from the end of the joint, and with my tri-square, ensuring that the stock of the tri-square is against the edge of the wood, I slide it along until I can draw a line exactly through my first mark. This line is then continued across one edge and then across the other. If I was marking a lot of joints, it would be sensible to put all the pieces of wood together in the vise, making sure that the ends are in line and marking across the edges at the same time. This second line will then need to be drawn across the face of the second piece of wood and across the last edge. We now need to mark the depth of the joint, in this case halfway across, hence the name halving joint. My wood is 19 millimetres thick. We will need to set a marking gauge, so half of 19 is 9.5. I need to mark this very accurately. If I make the joint too deep, then of course it will not fit well. If I make it not deep enough, it won't fit well either. Moving the stock of the marking gauge and adjusting it to 9.5. It is important that this is set exactly. I can jog the stock along by tapping the marking gauge on the bench. I'm holding the ruler so that the point or spur of the marking gauge against the ruler as if it was the needle of a dial or speedometer. It's also important to mark the depth from the side that we drew the original line. You may have been shown how to mark the sides of your wood with face side and face edge marks, and the stock of the marking gauge should always be against one or other of those surfaces. When we use the marking gauge, it's important that the spur of the marking gauge trails. It's rather like when you want to draw a line on a beach. If you push the stick, it will dig into the sand and not make a neat mark. If you drag the stick or draw it behind you, it will draw the line that you require. So trailing the spur of the marking gauge, I mark the depth. The stock of the marking gauge is touching the face side, or the side with our first line on. I mark in a similar fashion along the second edge, and I will now mark across the end. If this is too difficult to hold, and it is quite difficult with a narrow piece of wood, you can put your wood in the vise and holding the stock of the marking gauge in both hands, do a couple of practice runs and then roll the gauge over and make your line. That's the first joint marked out. The last but very important thing we need to do is to cross-hatch the waste. That's the piece of wood we're going to saw away. This is important. It helps us to saw on the proper side of the line. We're now ready to saw the joint, and we'll need a marking knife and tri-square in order to cut across the grain on the face of the wood. Place the point of the marking knife into the line and move the tri-square along with its stock against the edge of the wood until it touches the knife, and then make one or two cuts across. Now we take the bench hook and place it in the vise and place the wood against the stop with the saw cut as close to the end of the stop as we can. The saw we'll use is a tenon saw. It's quite acceptable to use a slightly smaller saw called a dovetail saw. That would depend on the type of work you were doing or even how big you are. We need to saw on the waste side of the line. The saw should saw half of our original pencil line away and leave half of the pencil line on the wood. If we sawed along the pencil line, we would actually saw a bit of the wood away that we want to keep. If we saw to one side of the pencil line, then our joint would be shorter than it should be. You may have been recommended by your teacher at this stage to cut a trough next to the marking knife line using a chisel. This will help you to position your saw in the correct place. Holding the saw in this position, and the way you hold the saw is very important, have a very straight wrist. Even if your wrist is fairly small and weak looking, it's actually very strong when it's held straight like this. Your elbow should be close to your body. It should be a straight line along the saw and up your arm looking from the front. And your finger should point along the saw. Position the blade against the edge of your thumb and begin to saw on the corner furthest away from yourself. The saw cut is right next to the marking knife line, so that one side of the blade is rubbing against the marking knife line, and the other side of the blade is into the waste wood. Once the saw cut is started, I gradually saw the saw level using the cut I'm making as a guide. If I started with the saw level straight away, the saw skids about and marks the surface of the wood, and the white line will not be accurate. Now I've sawn into the wood, I can follow my line through the wood, holding the saw level, and sawing down to the marking gauge line. It's important that I don't saw past the marking gauge line into the cheek of the joint. It's also important that the saw touches both marking gauge lines at the same time. Otherwise, I can saw down to the marking gauge line on one side and onto the other, but actually leave a bit of the joint in the middle that's not sawn. That then is the shoulder of the joint cut. You may have been recommended to saw the other part of the joint, the cheek of the joint first and the shoulder second. As in all crafts, there are alternative ways of doing the same job. To saw the cheek, we put the wood in the vise at about 45 degrees. We're going to saw down the cheek and then across the end of the wood, and then turn the wood over and repeat. Starting at the corner on the waist side of the line, so that the saw cut is on the waist side of the line with the curve in the waist. Starting against my thumb, I saw into the wood and down the edge of the wood to the first saw cut. And then begin to saw across the end So, I've sawn from the corner, down the edge, and across the end. I'm going to turn the wood round, the other corner, again at 45 degrees. This time, the waist side of the line is on the other side of the wood, starting at the corner. I saw down, notice the straight wrist, that's quite important. Or down the edge, once again to the first saw cut, and then across the end. If I've sawn that well, both saw cuts will form one line across the end. I can now put the wood upright in the vise, and holding the saw level, continue the saw cut down towards the shoulder. Now it's important at this stage not to saw until the waist falls out. Otherwise I may saw past my line. I saw down to the line on both sides. And if the waist still doesn't fall out, it probably means that I haven't sawn the cut into the shoulder properly. Luckily, mine fell out. So there's the sawn joint. If I've sawn it well, then you can test it against the side of another piece of wood. If you've not sawn it well, then you can secure it in the vise and pare it with a chisel until it fits. Don't attempt to file or sand the joint. It's almost impossible to file or sand a joint to fit. This is then repeated with the other piece of wood, and the two should fit together like this. That then is a corner halving joint.